One of the most daunting things for a photographer can be to approach strangers and ask to take their pictures. For me, I really started to get more into photography when I started traveling. I really loved exploring new places, meeting new cultures, meeting the local people. But very early on, I started having all these ethical questions. The problem is that obviously I'm white, I'm a man, and I come from a country that's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Not to mention that I've traveled to some countries carrying a camera that can cost as much as a local person's annual salary sometimes. So I really started to think about the dynamic between the photographer and the person who's being photographed, and how you can approach this in an ethical way, if possible at all. Especially when you're traveling and there might be also language or cultural barriers to overcome. And by the way, I'm talking about traveling, but a different culture doesn't necessarily need to be someone who lives in a different country. It can be any community, any group of people. A musical scene, for example, even in your own city, can be a different culture. A sports team can have their own culture. People from the same profession. Last year, I did a project here in Sydney about a public housing complex close to my home, and the residents there were their own community. I was definitely an outsider of their culture. So how do you approach a different culture, a different community when you're an outsider? Obviously, I don't have the exact recipe for that, but I can share what has kind of worked for me in the past. And for me, one of the most important things was always to have my intentions very clear. It's very important that you know why you're taking photos of them. Knowing exactly why you want to take photos of a certain group of people will help you get the message across to them as well, to your subjects. How do you expect them to accept and invite you into the group if you can't even explain to them why you want to take photos of them? And I really believe that this makes a huge difference even when people don't speak your language, even when you're traveling to a foreign country and you can't really interact with people, because people will sense whether you have good, genuine intentions or not from your mannerism, from the way you interact with them, from your facial expression, and the way you behave with them. And this kind of leads me to my second point, which is to actually be interested in the culture that you want to photograph. So be interested and show your interest to them. Ask questions, and most importantly, spend a lot of time with them. The more time you spend with your subjects, the better and deeper your relationship with them is going to be. You'll be able to learn more about them, about their culture, spend more time, and the more they'll let you into their community and accept you as part of their community as well. So ultimately, that will lead to better work for you as well, better photographs. And I also think it's very important to actually be more interested in the people themselves than in your own photographs. So you have to be okay with the fact that sometimes you'll spend a lot of time with the people you want to photograph, but you won't be able to take any good photos or any photos at all. And that's okay too. In terms of practical tips, I can only say that from my experience, it's always been useful to do your research as much as you can before you approach that community. So if you go to a different country, for example, there are travel guides, forums, websites that you can visit and you can ask questions. But it's very useful to know the rules and the customs of the culture that you're going to approach. In some countries, for example, it's not acceptable to photograph women, or street photography is frowned upon, or sometimes military buildings and people cannot be photographed too. It can also help a lot, or sometimes it's even necessary, to have a guide or a contact person that belongs to that community that you want to approach and that can introduce you, can mediate for you. And I think that's pretty much it for me. But if you had other experiences or if you have better advice, please share it in the comments below. Now, one last thing I want to add is that even if you do all these things that I've just listed, I think it's still very important to know and understand when it's a good time for you to take photos and when it's best to put your camera down and not to take photos. There's a quote from photographer John Free that says that knowing when not to take a picture is just as important as knowing when to take it.